Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming either via Zoom or in person. We really appreciate it. My name is Matthew Garrell. I'm on the editorial board here at Clementis, responsible for planning events such as this with our wonderful partners, Megan and Jared. Megan's somewhere on the Zoom, and then Jared's our wonderful producer for this evening. I'm also a graduate student in the Master of Arts in Liberal Studies program here at Dartmouth, or the MOUSE program, with a concentration in creative writing. Now, Clementis, the MOUSE Journal, is a biannual graduate student publication at Dartmouth. The journal aims to showcase the strongest pieces of creative and critical writing submitted by MOUSE students, MAL alumni, and graduates and Guarini graduate students. By selecting and integrating work from all four concentrations at MALS, creative writing, cultural studies, globalization, and general liberal studies, and from the broader Guarini community, we endeavor to promote intellectual engagement, fruitful questioning, and honest discourse within the realm of liberal studies. This evening, we're doing something distinctly different from our traditional reading series. We are proud to welcome author and MALS alumna, Joni B. Cole, to this Q&A.
Good to be back at the Howe.
So for those unfamiliar, this event we're doing, for those unfamiliar, will follow a traditional Q&A format on the subject of transitioning from writers either in an academic and or personal context into the professional spheres, emerging writers. In particular, we will discuss approaching literary agents, navigating publishers and editors, red flags in the industry, and things to look for that will ultimately benefit you and your work. We are fortunate and very grateful to have this discussion with Joni, who has experienced each of these aspects. Joni, now just a quick biography of Joni, for those unfamiliar. Joni B. Cole is the author of 7 books, including 2 writing guides, Good Naked, How to Write More, Write Better, and Be Happier, listed as one of the best books for writers by poets and writers, and Toxic Feedback, Helping Writers Survive and Thrive. American Book Review said of Toxic Feedback, I can't imagine a better guide to writing's rewards and perils than this fine book. Joni also created the 3-volume This Day in the Life of American Women series described by Publishers Weekly as fascinating and eye-opening. She runs the Writers Center of White River Junction, Vermont, and has been a teacher and speaker at a diversity of academic programs and writing conferences around the country, including AmeriCorps, the Independent Publishers of New England, Harvard's Continuing Medical Education Program, the Miami Book Fair, the Irma Bombeck Humor Writers Workshop. Joni is also a contributor of the Writer magazine and recently launched a regional monthly newspaper column entitled Realish. Her second collection of personal essays, Party Like It's 2044, Essays on Finding the Funny in Life and Death, is due for release this fall from the University of New Mexico Press. And more information can be found at www.jonibcole.com. Please, again, let's welcome Joni B. Cole.
Thank you, Matthew, for that introduction. And thank you, Jared and Megan, for hosting. I so appreciate you guys being here and having this opportunity.
I'd like to begin with the trajectory authors take in order to become published. Could you please speak to the traditional route and ultimately the one you took?
Okay. Well, we're lucky these days because there's a lot more avenues to publishing than there used to be. So there's actually 6 paths to publishing in general. And you asked about the traditional route. And that's the one, of course, that gets all the press, right? So there's the big traditional route, which are the 5 big publishers. They're all New York based. And let's see, Hachette, HarperCollins, Penguin Random House, Simon & Schuster, and Macmillan are the big 5 from New York. The big 5 might become the big 4 pretty soon. I don't know what's going on with the Simon & Schuster deal, but pretty soon they'll all be owned by one big conglomeration. But that's the publishing route that most people hear about. And then there's another traditional publishing route. So same thing, they opt to buy your book, and sometimes you get an advance and they put it out and distribute it. So same route, but they're smaller houses, not that much smaller, but they're independent. And maybe Wiley is an example, Houghton Mifflin is an example, Kensington, if you read Love Stories is an example. That's a great traditional route. And in addition to that, academic presses are part of that route too. So those are all traditional publishers. And then you've got the small presses that are also traditional publishers, but they can be very, very small. They might only print on demand. They might not offer any advances, very likely they won't. Distribution is extremely limited, but that's a lovely and legitimate route. And then you keep going down to the hybrid publishers, which is fairly new, but they've been around for a while. One of the biggest ones is She Writes Press. And a hybrid model is, I think in the old days, it would have been called vanity publishing, but it's not like that quite so much anymore, where you pay, and sometimes you pay a lot, but you pay for a publisher who knows how to put a book together to do just that. And while they do vet the books a little bit, it's not nearly as selective a process as the other traditional routes. So the difference between, say, that hybrid publisher and the others is you're putting out money to be published with a hybrid publisher. And then as you continue, there's self-publishing, which you do it all by yourself, which is Kindle Direct Publishing, for example. And then there's blogging. So the beautiful thing is, depending on what kind of book you have, you can find the right route for you. Just because the big five get all the press doesn't mean it's even right for your book. So in my own publishing trajectory, we were talking about this a little earlier. Oh my goodness, that's just been everywhere. And so one of the first books I did was through an imprint of Random House. So all these big publishers have imprints. So they have lots of little publishing units underneath them, but it was through Random House. So that was an experience. And then the next book was through a New York independent publisher. And then the next one was a much smaller independent publisher. And then I've also been published, and my current books are at a university press. And so I've been all over the place, but each equally meaningful. And again, it's about fit as much as, anything else. So that's sort of an overview of both traditional publishing and then all the other ways that you can get your work out there. And I find it encouraging because the gatekeepers no longer have such a lock anymore. Or it's not just an either or, where you got to get an agent and you got to maybe get lucky with one of those big five, or you're a goner, or self-publishing even. There's ways in between to find somebody who might be a really meaningful match for your project, your book, your whether it's a collection of essays, or which is what my genre is, or whether it's a novel, or whether it's nonfiction for that matter. So did that answer your question? Did that give a good overview for you guys of the routes to publishing?
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody have a quick clarifying question or anything along those lines?
Well, do you send a query letter? How do you approach these?
Carefully. No, I'm kidding. All of the places will need some kind of query or proposal, synopsis. Depending on the genre you're writing in a novel, you'll probably need to do a whole synopsis of your novel. You'll need a full manuscript. But of course it does, as you noted, it starts with a query. And from there, you might get an invitation to submit 10 pages or so, or now follow up with a proposal. So rarely do you want to just send somebody the whole manuscript, And again, if you're working with the big five or trying to get an agent, you send all that to them. First, you have to query an agent to get an agent. And then the agent does the work of querying the editors. And if you're working with one of those independent publishers, then you can often send them your query directly. Online is every resource you need to, so that you can look up, maybe Kensington is a good publisher for me. You can look up exactly what they publish, whether you have to be agented, what they're looking for in that initial query. And then on top of that, of course, there's volumes written about how to write a query letter. I love doing workshops on that because I think it's interesting, but there's a real template in a way. You still have to be you and sound yourself and exciting and interesting and unique. And yet there's also a template where you don't just go off in la la land when you send a query. But yeah, most places, it's just like the query is. So it's a good question.
And actually, that question really naturally transitions into the next question that I had for you, which is, I understand the route an author takes differs a great deal when it comes to fiction versus nonfiction. When one intends to explore publication, what are the first steps you recommend for fiction and nonfiction, respectively? The things that I was taught personally was in fiction, you would want to have an entire manuscript before you approach a literary agent.
Right.
Conversely, with nonfiction, you could potentially pitch the idea that you would be writing about
Right.
and researching to the literary agent there. So could you comment on that and maybe
Sure,
the
sure.
routes there?
We've done good homework. The publisher, might welcome both queries and submissions from fiction and narrative nonfiction writers. So the distinction isn't so much there, but the distinction is exactly as you said. If you're a first-time novelist, you have to have that novel done. Because what if you get lucky and send me your manuscript? And you're like, well, I haven't finished it. Well, they're not going to be interested. They're not writing teachers. They're not hand holders. So you want the whole manuscript written. With a narrative nonfiction book, then the emphasis is on the proposal. What are you going to write about? What's your authority on writing about that? Sometimes the proposal, I just read this and it was stunning to me because as a writer and a writing teacher, I thought, really? But sometimes the proposal matters more than your own writing ability if you have a great topic. Platform matters a ton for a nonfiction project. If you're going to go to a traditional big publisher, they're going to want to see thousands of followers already. Obviously, as I said, your authority in writing. So you can look at the same range of or spectrum of publishers sometimes across genres, but what you are going to submit initially can be very different with fiction and narrative nonfiction. So the last book I sold was a collection of essays, and I'm not sure how I got away with this, but I had to write a hefty proposal, a query, of course, at first, then a hefty proposal, and I was able to submit about 10 essays for the collection, which ended up being 20 essays. So I didn't have to have a full collection, but certainly with fiction, you want to have the whole thing done, unless you're one of those seasoned writers and you might get a 2-book deal or something like that.
So you touched upon the query letter a couple times.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could give some specifics of
Sure.
whether it be the formatting of that query letter, how long it should be.
Yeah.
I know that in the past, folks, have gone to publishers and sat in their offices and tried to get a meeting. Is that the route to take? Would you? Is it better to handwrite a letter and send that off with your manuscript? Is it better to send an email? What is the proper approach, and what are some key things you want to include in that query?
Yeah, I would hope connections, happen in every weird way imaginable. Like you just show up at somebody's office or on the subway or whatever, or handwrite a letter because you don't have a computer. And I would love for those people to also get an in. But typically, much more typically, 99.9% of the time, there's just that traditional, you write it, it should be, now almost everything is online too, which is kind of nice. You don't have to do all those self-addressed stamped envelopes and all, but a page, maybe, very economical, concise. You want to start out by one of the biggest mistakes people write in their query letters, all they do is a plot summary. And no matter how wonderful your book is or your storyline is, a summary is a summary and will never engage someone. So the first paragraph is often just a hook. Here's why my book is so cool, and the unique elevator pitch kind of thing that will make you just really want to find out more. Another aspect of it is often, what are some comparables? What are some books that are like your book, but yours is uniquely different, that are already selling? So some sense that really helps them understand, the genre of what the book is. You want some factual information. How many words is it? You've completed the manuscript. It fits in the genre of speculative fiction or romance or whatever. And certainly in the last paragraph or so, information about yourself. I have a platform of 10,000 followers, or, I've raised 17 children or something, and people sometimes get discouraged, but I haven't published yet, which is what we're talking about. How as emerging writers do you get published? And it isn't always, a huge problem if you haven't been published yet, but you do need to capture yourself as a character, as an interesting person, and a person this agent might want to work with in the little bio part of it. There's a lot of templates for query letters. So, because you don't want to be too creative, but on the other hand, you have to stand out. I was on a panel for a publishing panel, and it's funny because there was 2 agents sitting next to each other, and the one person says, I never want you to start with some big hook or whatever. Don't try to bamboozle me or whatever. And then next agent, beside her was saying, I love that. And they even were sort of getting into verbal fisticuffs. One thought, scented stationery back in the day when it was more mailed in was beautiful. And the other one said, if I ever get a scented envelope, I will say, no, I won't even open it. I'll just throw it out. So agents are people, and that's the thing that's helped me the most, agents and editors, is when I get all twisted, like, will they like this? And second guessing myself, and will they like that? I really stop and remember, they're just people. What would I like? I don't want to be sort of, I don't know, wooed in a way where it's false flattery or whatever. I just want to be convinced. And a query letter often takes a ridiculous amount of drafts for you to feel that you get it right. Make sure that you kind of run it by some of your peers. How are they reacting to it? Did you capture your book in a way that makes it exciting but not dense or thick? There was one other thing about query letters I wanted to say too, but now it slipped my mind, but I'll remember it later and think about it. But yeah, I'll remember it later.
No, those are all really wonderful points. Thank you.
Good, yeah.
So first, does anybody have any questions on that? Yeah, please.
So, like sometimes, because I know you said like a lot of it is online now, like sometimes it's just like a form, like you're not reaching out to like a specific person, it's just like you fill out a form.
Via submittable is the way a lot of publications now, ask you to submit,
Is that like trustworthy, or is it better to like reach out to like someone directly?
I think submittable is very legit. You know, it just, once again, distances us a little bit, makes us feel like, we're just screaming into the void. But that is where I just remember there is a person over there, an agent and an editor and a publisher doesn't have a business without us, you know. So, and the letter still has to maintain the humanity, the excitement, all the same things. So whether you submit it through submittable, something like that, or whether you can do it directly to the agent's office or the editor's office, you know, just remember there's a real person there. What would you like to hear? You know, where would you begin to feel like, I don't trust this person or like this writer? So, certainly in individual pieces, essays or short stories, submittable is very common when you're submitting individual pieces. Yeah.
So I'd like to, before we move on to the next question, I'd like to just circle back real quick to, in the event of folks that maybe they haven't published before, but they are trying to write this query letter and they're trying to come up with certain important things to say about themselves, what they've accomplished, but they haven't had this major publication yet. What are some recommendations you would have for somebody in that particular case, whether they went to an MFA, MA program in creative writing, or they've just been writing on their own? What are some things worth including at that point?
Yeah, well, it's funny because even writing your bio as part of a query letter can take several drafts and you're writing by yourself. But again, you want to characterize you the way you might characterize a really interesting person. So if you volunteer or if you do something interesting. The other thing a bio really allows for is the reader and the recipient hears your voice. So how you write the bio versus just a bunch of facts, how you write it so that it captures your voice is important. So anything interesting that you've done, engaging things that you've done. One important, I think, aspect that will make a editor or an agent sit up is, have you been in a workshop? Have you workshopped this manuscript? Have you had readers? Have you had beta readers? I think that's a really important factual bit that goes either in your bio or somewhere in the query letter, because you can imagine they just get so many of these queries a day. It makes you come off with more authority. If you said this entire manuscript has been revised and workshopped, and and so you really, that is one overarching thing you want to achieve in the query, is that you have an authority as a writer. You're not just dashing something out with a lack of respect. You really have an authority, have worked on this manuscript and believe in it. And so, and it doesn't have to be bells and whistles, because the other thing that really helps to remember is you want to get in the door. The query letter is only step one, but if it just needs to be good enough to get in the door so that they ask for those 10 pages. If you don't get any responses, because authors or writers rather, get ghosted all the time. So really just shore up on your ego, because it just happens all the time. And it isn't necessarily, a matter of how well you write. But if you're being ghosted and getting no responses, then clearly rework that query letter. Get more feedback on it. If they ask for pages and then you get ghosted, then it's probably there's something in those first pages you might want to rethink. But if you don't get any response from a query letter after, I don't know, 20 submissions, then really, and I'd actually revisit it before 20 ghostings, then rethink it, get more feedback on it, figure it out. So, yeah.
Thank you. So we just talked a lot about literary agents, but before we can even speak to them, we need to know how to find them.
Right.
Before that, before we even do that, can you please describe the specific role that a literary agent fulfills and why they are so important to writers?
Yeah. Well, if you're going to go the agent route, and outside of the big five, whether or not you need an agent is subjective. Sometimes you don't need an agent. Like I've had agents, but for my last publications and connected with my last publishers, I didn't have an agent. But if you're going to go the agent route, if you really have the kind of book, the big, potentially commercial book, or the topical book that could get the kind of sales that the big five are looking for, then you do require an agent. And so the way to find one, there's resources out there. Publishers market.com is a definitive resource. And the agents and the agencies will have their stuff up there. Here's what we take. Here's what we want. Here's the form of submissions we want. Here's what we're not looking for. Another place is Query Tracker is another place. And I think they have both these are online, have both a free version and a paid version, Duotrope. So there's great resources out there to begin to really shop around for agents, because fit is everything. And you'll be able to see what other kinds of books they publish. That was the thing I was going to say is make sure that in that query letter, they know that you know about them, that this isn't just a form letter that you now press send to 7 people. So if you can reference what their latest book they published or represented was, that's really going to help. And that's the kind of research you can do on publishersmarket.com or querytracker.com. And in the end, say all things being equal and you all have beautiful manuscripts, which I'm sure you do, the fit is everything, and so that is really why you want to do that research, a lot of research to find the right agent. Or if you're not going an agented route because you don't need to, because you have an independent publisher that doesn't necessarily require the work that's submitted being agented, do the same amount of research for the publication then. So.
Now, what about the role of the writer in relation to the literary agent, the editor, and the publisher?
Yeah.
So would you be willing to break down that dynamic
Sure.
and give us like a kind of a general understanding of, as a writer, as aspiring writers, what is our part to play in all of this, and what can we hope to expect from these different individuals?
Well, from the agent, if you get an agent, you should really hope to expect they're your representative, your business representative. They better know how to negotiate contracts. They better really be on your side. They're your advocate. And you better get a sense that they're enthusiastic, because if they're not enthusiastic with you, how are they going to be enthusiastic with the editors they sell to? Editors also have a fairly small, intimate roster of editors that they know, oh, this editor would like her work, this editor would like it. So, but the agent's role is that they are really your advocate. And then the editor's job, of course, the acquiring editor's job, if they like it, is to begin to ratchet it up the decision-making process, because the editor is only, unfortunately, the first decision maker. I've had editors who said yes to my book, and then the sales and marketing people said no. So the editor's job is also to be an advocate for this property. But, and then you, as the writer, you just sit there and wait for the phone to ring, but those days are way past, right? So, you just stare at your inbox and hope you'll get good news. But you want to be, I swear, some of my publishing contracts came because I was a writer easy to work with. And that didn't mean I caved at all editorially. Just now I rejected the cover of a book this week because I'm in the production phase of it. Or, I've turned down a lot of suggestions my editors given editorially. But beyond that, I am an angel to work with, because it really, remember, these are people, and they're going to want to work with people they want to work with. And so to be accommodating, to be on time, to measure how often I bug them, is really important, to be fun and to be nice. And so that's a big role, I think, that the writer can play in the acquisition process. Because if there's one thing that could maybe tip the scale, you or another book, it could be, but I want to work with this person. She seems nice. She seems, all other things being equal, that the books are equal, the writing ability is different but equal. So that's a big role I think the writer has. And, one of the biggest complaints notoriously that authors have about both agents and editors, but specifically agents, is they don't keep in contact. You don't know where your book stands. And so sometimes it's the writer's job to push a little bit, but not so much that the agent or the editor gets annoyed. But so it's a delicate dynamic, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So does anyone have any questions on that point or anything that we just discussed?
How long if you've reached out to agents, that they might respond to you? I think someone in the Mel's course the other day said they got a response back from an agent or someone like months later.
Oh, yeah.
Which was unusual. He said that was the worst ever, but they can take a while. How long?
It's all over the place. You could get a quick no, you could get a quick yes. That could happen what you just described. Like I said, ghosting is really, really popular. You might not get any answer. But then I've done a lot of author interviews, particularly for toxic feedback about authors' experiences with agents and editors. And Khaled Hosseini, for example, would send out queries 6 at a time. And this was when he was trying to sell the Kite Runner. And I think he'd sent out about 36 and he gave up. Enough is enough. He didn't hear from anyone. And one of the agents that he did hear, though, from said, oh, Afghanistan is passe, right? And so luckily his wife said, you're not going to stop. So 6 more and 6 more. And then almost in the immediate second batch, he got a yes. And we all know what happened with the Kite Runner. And then actually, I've gotten such good stories from writers in the book Toxic Feedback that have talked about their experience with agents. And one woman got immediate yeses. First novel, immediate yeses from 3 or 4. And one was this big LA agent. And darling, she kept calling her darling. We're going to make a star of you, but you're just going to go by your first name and you're beautiful and on and on. But the problem is we're going to change this fictional book to nonfiction because this was the rare case. She had not even written that much. Such was the power of her prose. But so she was like, oh, okay. She's kind of like blinded by and luckily over the weekend, she got a call from another big agent and they talked. And before she could send off her yes to the first agent, they talked and she had a much better rapport and connection with the second agent. And that's who she went with. She ended up on the cover of Publishers Weekly. The book was successful. But so maintaining your integrity is also the role of the writer because it is so easy. Actually, it happened to me too. It is so easy to sell out. If you think, oh my gosh, big time publishers want me. And yet sometimes they're trying to change your vision. And sometimes they have a lot of good to say too, but so you really have to stick to that vision without being blind to how the book could be improved. So, yeah. I'm sorry, that's a vague answer, but they're all over the place. You could hear from someone a year later, sorry, I gave birth to twins, but I'm just now getting back to this. Are you still looking for an agent? I've actually known someone that happened with too. So and she was still looking for an agent, so it worked out.
The topic of maintaining integrity as a writer naturally transitions into this next point that I wanted to bring up with you, which is when you're working with either a literary agent or it gets to the point where you're talking with a publisher or maybe an editor, what are some immediate red flags new writers should be very aware of?
Yeah. Well, you should never pay an agent to read. And they don't make money until they sell your book, too, just so we all know that. But you should never pay. There was just a scathing article about some small presses who now they have reading fees, which is not legitimate, which is valid sometimes. But apparently some of these smaller presses, there's about a handful of them, were really taking people's money and then not following through or would even accept pieces and then they would appear nowhere. So there's those kinds of stories. But if an agent is in publishersmarket.com, for example, they're going to be a good agent. If they're not asking for money, if you have a good vibe about them, then I'm sure you're going to be in good hands. Again, it's more about the fit. Will they be able to sell your book? But very rarely will they even take a book if they don't think that it's a good fit. So, so there's some red flags, but it's a legit business for sure. You just want to you just don't want to be throwing money at people who promise you things when, they won't deliver.
So you touched on the right fit. What are some, kind of going the opposite way now, what are some specific things that authors should look for that indicate the right fit for them with an agent?
Yeah. Well, if you have I'll take myself as an example, a rather literary collection of essays, I would be wasting a lot of time trying to find an agent to go to the big five. Maybe I love my publishers. It could end up selling 1 million copies, but they are going to be looking for books that have a print run of no less than probably starting 10,000. And so you don't want to waste your time. If you don't want to be one of the masses and you think your book maybe would do better with more attention, but at a smaller publishing house, then you probably want to gravitate towards one of those. There was a really good story I had of a friend of mine who's been in my workshop forever, and she finished her novel, beautiful writer, got an agent. Agent tried to sell it for a year or so, and even her agent, who became her friend, ghosted her. I tell you, these agents ghost a lot. But so I shortly after that met her for coffee. I hadn't seen her for quite a while, and she was, well, I'm starting a new novel, which is always a good idea anyway, but I've given up on that book, just given up. And I said, well, did you go to that second realm I was talking about? Traditional publishers, the Wileys, the Kensingtons, Houghton Mifflin, they're big publishers or significant, meaningful publishers. And within a month, she'd gotten 2 offers. So we cannot just focus on the big 5 unless, and I'm not saying don't go for the gold if you have that kind of book. But I have to also say that I did have a book with the big 5, and it was probably one of my least pleasant experiences, which is not to say it was unpleasant, but which is I always felt like, oh, I'm the tiniest of the tinies in here, and just the whole vibe was a little off from my personality and for me. And if you don't sell immediately, they don't have backlists, they have expectations up to here, and they have a lot of criteria that only have to do with sales figures. And that's not a criticism, they're just a business. And so that wasn't a good fit for me, even though I'd sold the book to Crown, which is the imprint of Random House. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you kind of touched on this, but maybe just a little more clarification. You touch on the sort of control the author has with smaller publications or with working with one of the top 5. Could you talk a little bit more about specifically what those types of controls
Absolutely.
look like?
Yeah, editorially speaking, we're the boss. That said, we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot if we didn't really pay attention, if the editor had some strong suggestions. They know the publishing world and they know readers. So if we get too precious, we could be overlooking this enormous talent that's trying to help us and help herself too. I say herself because often editors are women. But we do have control. I have thought through, and that's the first thing. Think through every bit of feedback that an editor gives. Really think, because the first knee-jerk reaction is often, what's her problem? She doesn't get it, or defensiveness or fear. Oh, now I've got to make all these changes. And I still, to this day, 7 books later, will have that. But now I only have it for like a blip. And then I realize, calm down. She's just giving you some suggestions. And I have rejected a lot of suggestions after really thoughtful interpretation of what they said. This is no different than I would say being in a workshop where you're going to get feedback coming at you from right and left, and probably some really good feedback and some crazy feedback and some feedback that you might not necessarily want to act on, but it has informed the writing process. And often the translation of that feedback isn't what somebody's telling you to do, but how you would now do that, informed by the feedback. And that's very similar to working with an editor too. And they are the authority on selling books and publishing books. So they do have a view and a perspective that you don't, because you're the writer and you're inside the box. But, and when you have a contract with the big 5, I don't know if this is still true, but you have very little control over the cover. This is if you're an emerging author, first-time author. You have very little control over the design of the book, the cover image. That does not mean you can't debate it. But, and even in the other realms of publishing, that's probably the arena where you have the least control. But I mentioned, in one of the books, I saw a cover and, oh my goodness, it was so awful. But so even in the realm of covers, I've been able to say, no, Could you rethink that? Or, yes, it's about 70% there, but could you do this? Would you be willing to do this? And similar to how you don't want to be micromanaged as a writer, you don't want to micromanage a designer. Like, could you make that font a little different? But you do want to be specific in what is working for you and what isn't working for you. So you have freedom to debate with your editor, but don't shoot yourself in the foot. And you have freedom to sound in about the other aspects of your book as it sort of crawls towards publication. So they set the pub date, though. There's things you don't have control over. But one big surprise, and maybe I don't want to preempt any of your questions, but one big surprise when you work with almost any publishing house, and this includes the big publishing houses, unless you're a big name, is you will probably be disappointed in the amount of support or publicity that they do for you. It is very different than the times when you used to read about, the big book tour and things like that. And that's across the board, even the big traditional publishing houses. You will have to do a lot of your own publicity. So it's just, I've written articles about this. It's a different job description being an author and a writer. And being an author, I would say these days that part of the job description is to sell your book. Doesn't mean out of your trunk of your car, obviously. Though that's not a bad thing either. But yeah, social media, talks, I find some authors really are snobby and poo-poo it. I just think it's a beautiful way to connect with readers. So you can think of it as hawking your book, and yeah, you are. But I think of it more as, you get to meet readers. You get to talk to people. So, but that's definitely one thing that the writer has to take responsibility for in the publishing journey.
Wonderful. And from what you said, it's kind of funny. That was like my next point on the advertising aspect.
Yeah.
And then when you're talking about the big publishers versus the smaller ones, there's going to be a great fluctuation in that dynamic.
But if you're a small potato at a big publisher, you might get very little support. If you're a bigger potato, if that analogy still works, at one of the independents, you'll get a little more attention. And I had mentioned one of the 6 paths to publishing is hybrid publishing. And one of the stars in that realm is She Writes Press. You would not believe how much they do for their authors. It's crazy. So, and great. So again, you can kind of, one way to get a feel for it, if you're lucky enough to have a choice in which publisher you choose, is you can talk to some of their authors and see if, they feel supported or if they feel that they could work with the publishing house to get the word out there. So, but you're going to have to do a lot of that work yourself.
So on that point, does anyone have any questions on anything we just talked about before we move on? No? Okay. So I'd like to pivot back to your personal trajectory at this point. Now, first, what role, as a MALS alumna, what role did Dartmouth play, more specifically the MALS program play, in cultivating your abilities as a writer, your kind of trajectory, your professional trajectory as an author?
Yeah. Well, I love going to the MALS program, and I'm not just saying that. I really did love it. And I guess I was on the creative writing track, and that my thesis was a collection of short stories, but I didn't take that many creative writing classes. And I've already been dipping my toe into teaching creative writing, though now I can say this comfortably. I was not that qualified yet, but it's been 25 years and I'm very qualified now. But I love the experience, for one thing, because being a writer means being open to the world. In a liberal studies program or liberal arts program, the education that I got, the realms that I was able to learn in, it was just amazing. So that was one thing that just made me a better writer and a more curious person. Interestingly enough, at Dartmouth, some of the feedback I got there really foundationally changed not only my writing life, but myself, my professional trajectory. For example, I had one professor who told me a manuscript that I turned in, his only feedback was, it's all wrong. And so from that, I learned how to be a better teacher, you know? And I got another professor who told me about a paper. This was in a non-creative writing class. I was having to explain it. He said, "Oh, you talk a lot better than you write." And I was already publishing, you know. But so those are hard experiences, really hard experiences. They were defining experiences for me, really, because one almost made me stop creative writing. It's all wrong. What the heck do you do with that? But it totally informed my teaching life and everything I do. And I didn't stop. And to this day, I'm so grateful because we're all going to encounter difficult feedback. We're all going to encounter a ton of rejection, and you cannot let it stop you. And the fellow that said you talk better than you write, which in the case of that paper was absolutely true, because I've never been able to write a good research paper or academic paper. But I can see years later how that helped me so much, because in my own creative writing, I sometimes start with a very stilted voice. It takes me a while to get to my own voice. And when I get to a conversational voice, which is sort of how I hear my thoughts in my head, that is when I'm at my best. And that's what almost all my books reflect. And I think that's why I gravitated towards personal essay, because I could finally access my own voice like I talk. That said, when I write, I revise about 40 times each piece. I mean, to get it pitch perfect. And what I love in the reviews that I get sometimes is it's a combination of literary, and people note the writing, but they also talk about the conversational style. And that hybrid is what is a sweet spot for me. And I swear that comment that I got about how I talk better than I write, somehow that informed that. So the breadth of the education I got at Dartmouth was fantastic. Some of even the harshest feedback I got was fantastic. And I would also say, though, that one of the best experiences among many I had at Dartmouth was just on Monday night when the Dartmouth Writers Society met for a workshop, and I got to be there, and everybody wrote from a prompt and shared and offered feedback. And the community of writers that I'm constantly able to be in, including the one on Monday night, thanks to the Dartmouth Writers Society, to me, that has fed my writing life more than anything. Whether I even share my writing or not, to be around other writers, to hear feedback, to see people putting their early drafts out, to see how to build works from their strengths up, even when they're imperfect because they've, only a rehearsal or a beginning draft. Any educational program, whether it's a workshop or an MFA class or whatever, I think really can engender that kind of community spirit. And, writing is a very solitary act, but it doesn't have to be a lonely one. And people sometimes skirt others or skirt feedback, and it really, really works against you. So the community of being in a program like Dartmouth is just invaluable, I think. And the level of teaching, of course, and the level of writing and peer support.
Thank you for that. And you touch on this briefly, and I'd like to kind of press a little bit more on it, is the editing process you've developed when you know something is worth pursuing publication of. So what is your process for editing that piece to get it up to publishable standards?
Yeah. Well, I said 40 drafts, but I meant more like 40 million drafts. But yeah, it's just, whatever it takes. The one thing related to publishing, though, is that a mistake that a lot of writers make is in our eagerness to get published, we go out there with something that hasn't been edited and re-edited to our own standards so that it mirrors our integrity, our editorial integrity. Because now developmental editors or acquiring editors or agents, they're not there to teach you how to write. And, you get their attention for a second. And so you really want to go out with your strongest work. And so workshopping your pieces, revisiting it, giving yourself distance between your own drafts, taking workshops, knowing craft. My goodness, one disappointment I've had in many programs is seeing how little instruction happens in MFA programs. It's ridiculous. I get a lot of what I call MFA refugees coming into my writing workshops in the community, and they don't even know what a scene is. Now, these are smart people. They might have beautiful voices and even writing styles, but to not know the most fundamental thing about how to write scenes or how to show and tell or, narrative techniques. And so acquire craft and get feedback. Those two things really inform your editorial process, and they make writing so much more fun because you can stare at the page and think, well, this is pretty good, but I don't know. When you understand the craft of writing, you have a blueprint for how to write forward. And it's still a practice, but it makes writing so much more fun. You're not just flailing in the dark, how will I make this better? Or how will I make people like it? So, and there's great books on craft. And of course, a workshop will support and supplement, the editorial process too.
So in your particular case, once you finished up your education, where did you turn to publish your first book?
Well, my first book was a nonfiction book. It was the first book in the This Day in the Life of American Women series. And I was having a terrible day, and I had little kids, and it was miserable weather, and I'm staring out the window in my pajamas past noon, thinking every single woman in America is having a better life than me right now. And I thought, hey, that'd be really interesting. What is everyone doing right now, like at 1:12 p.m. on a Monday, right? And so that is the genesis of that book. And it was a high concept book, meaning it was a really good idea. So it was one of those nonfiction book proposals where the idea really sold the book. So I did get an agent, and I actually got two for that book, because the first one, every path to publishing is winding. The first woman, they were both really big names. Well, the first one ended up being, I think, not quite right in the head. And so quickly we moved on to a second one. She was with ICM, which is one of the biggest literary agencies. And she was great, and she sold it to Crown, but it was always fraught. We had, I think, 5 interests, 5 meetings, and in the end we got 1 offer. And it was an interesting meeting, and even then there was some input that maybe we were to change my vision more than I was willing to. But that was great, and so that was good. And then we did a second series, but the first one didn't sell enough, so we found another traditional publisher and sold that. And then for the third book in the series, we got another publisher for that. So you'd think that one publisher would want all 3, but it wasn't. And so all 3 traditional publishers, all 3 big publishers, but each one sort of said, sales figures, what did they say? There's a pat line they always say, the numbers don't add up. You're in trouble when they use that line, the numbers don't add up. But the series was really fun, and that was my entree into publishing. And then after that, I wrote a writing guide, and then a collection of essays, and then another writing guide, and now I'm doing another collection of essays. And will have by the fall 7 books published. I've had 5 different publishers, pretty much across that, well, not quite across that whole path to publishing that I talked about, because I've never done blogging or things like that, but pretty much the big publisher, the second biggest publisher, the independent publisher, and then and 3 out of my 5 publishers went under shortly after my book was published. So I don't know what that says about my books, but that's pretty typical too. It's a very moving, foundation. So, and when one of the publishers went under is when I decided I would just self-publish that book on my own. So just to try it, because I get asked a lot about self-publishing, and I'm not an expert on it, but I thought I would try it. And so I hired somebody to design it. And so I reissued that book as a self-published book. So I've dipped my toe in almost every realm of publishing. So not hybrid publishing, I haven't done that.
So you touched on this briefly, but just to kind of further focus on that, when you're transitioning from the first thing you've published into the second to the third and so on and so forth, what challenges stayed the same as consistent pushback or things that you had to overcome? And what did you notice that changed? And I understand you kind of had a winding path for sure.
Right. What didn't change was, I had to keep selling myself. There was no easy in. And so the proposals had to be super solid and well-researched and well-written. And many of them, there was a lot of meetings as it went up that wheel of, towards yes. But there was then like 4 cogs forward, 1 cog back, But it's interesting because I've had so many things that we read about that can go wrong in the publishing journey happen to me. But in the end, really everything went right because I got 7 books published. But, publishers going under, publishers that, editors leaving, and then your book is orphaned, somebody saying yes, but then the salespeople saying no. So it was always, you can never relax in a way. The last couple books have been easier. And I don't really know why. You still have to sell your books, but a little bit more authority or whatever. I think I have a reputation as someone who is very professional. I am working with publishers where sales figures matter, but they're not the only thing that matters. And I was talking about when you're judging whether an agent is right for you, do you read an enthusiasm that makes you feel like they're really on your side, they really get you, and they will carry that enthusiasm over when they're talking to the editors they're trying to sell your book to on your behalf. And I feel like that enthusiasm that I have has also helped me too. They know that I'll be all in. I don't poo-poo selling my own book or doing events or, complaining about this. When I reject anything from an editorial suggestion to a cover, there's reasons, and I give them really thoughtfully. And so being that writer never hurts either. So, but I'm now working on a proposal for another collection, and for once the editor said, "Oh, we could work on it together." I've never had that before, so that was a big difference. It's always, I'll think up this thing, I'll talk about it ad nauseum to everyone. I'll work on it for 6 or 8 months to just get the proposal and some substantive material written, and then I'll go out there and knock on the door or two. And so that's been a nice thing to have this editor say, if you want, we can work on the proposal together, which, then it would be kind of shocking if we worked on it together and then they still said no. But you really don't know. So wish me luck.
So lastly, Joni, is there anything else you'd like to add to our discussion up to this point about anything we've talked about before we shift to the open Q&A?
Yeah. I just remember going to a lot of publishing panels and being so discouraged after I left. Forget about it. No, emerging writers don't have a chance anymore, and it's all about money. And I don't want you to leave with that. I feel like there are a lot of paths to publishing, and why not you? Why not me? And so you have to put in the work for the writing, of course, but I think that it is a business. And if you do this and approach it thoughtfully, there are really well-known and actionable steps that you can take to make it happen. And it will never happen as quickly as you want, probably. And sometimes that ends up being a good thing. But it doesn't serve to be discouraged about the publishing process. It also doesn't serve to go through it alone. There's rejection clubs, which a lot of writers have, because it's almost like badges of honor. So know that it can and will happen, but it's, it'll probably be all the work that we talked about, researching the right fit, hanging in there, reworking your proposal or your query letter or your manuscript if you need to, but it can absolutely happen. And I left many publishing panels with the feeling that the message, this will never happen to you, little writer in the audience, I'm talking about myself. And so I showed them. So it can definitely happen. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So now, open Q&A. If anybody has anything they want to ask Joni, anybody online, feel free to either write your question in the chat or raise your hand, and our wonderful producer will give you the spotlight.
Joni, I know that you said earlier about having a try at the self-publishing. How did that go? What did you think of that?
I think that it was really good because, for one thing, the book was dead in the water. And so here it is now on Amazon. And that's usually the outlet when you self-publish. And I know a lot of people who've been very successful with self-publishing. A friend of mine who writes detective novels, he publishes through Kindle Direct. And his son does the covers. They're fantastic. And oh my God, he makes a lot of money on those books. So, you have to have that intrepid spirit, because you're going to have to put resources together, meaning it's a cheap route to publishing, relatively speaking. So I don't mean that resource-wise. I mean, there's some cost involved. But, if you can't design a cover, you want someone who can design a cover. You have to price your book, get the ISBN number. All of these are very doable things, and I think Amazon though I didn't do this myself, but Amazon really can walk you through it too. Or another self-publisher, it sounds ironic, but if you can hire a self-publisher who knows it, which is what I did, who knew how to design the interior of the book. And we actually did the cover, my partner and I, because he is a designer and an artist. But yeah, so it's a great route. And again, it's really about what are your goals too. I kept talking about fit, but it's also what are your goals? I know somebody who, for example, went the hybrid publishing route, and she has now her second literary novel coming out. They're great. They are certainly worthy of a Random House or a Hatchet Group or whatever, but she didn't feel like wasting all that time, And so that route really worked for her. I have friends who self-publish because they want to get those books out. The danger, if you will, but you're in charge of this, so it won't happen, is some people go out and self-publish and the books are just awful, because they didn't edit them or work on them, or they're loaded with misspellings or whatever. And that doesn't only happen in self-published books. It can happen across the board because editors rarely edit too much anymore. But it's a great avenue if it meets your goals, and you can make money on it. So, and the thing is, we write, I'm assuming because we're not writing in a secret diary or a private journal, we're writing to mean and communicate something to other people. And if for whatever reason, you don't feel it's right for a traditional publisher, or you just don't want to bother, wow, what a great resource to self-publish. So yeah, so absolutely. I know a lot of people who have self-published and are very thrilled with it, and now working on their second or third or fourth book. So that's what I mean about we have much more control now too. There are not gatekeepers saying you will never get that book to see the light of day. No, you will if you want to go that route. And then you could go the hybrid route. The vetting, like I said, is not nearly as much, but then you're going to pay a lot more money and you might get more support, but it's a question of how much is it worth that support, because you'll never probably earn back how much you pay to that hybrid publisher. In fact, even when you get an advance from a traditional publisher at the other end, rarely do you earn out the advance. So it's interesting how book sales can be. You might make more money on a self-published book than, say, a traditionally published book from a publisher who didn't give you an advance. So you make royalties for sure, but how much? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does,
Good.
thank you.
Are you thinking of self-publishing?
No, I was just curious when you said you'd done it, and you talked a bit more about those other more traditional routes, but not how that one went for you and how you felt about it.
Yeah,
So
no,
I wanted to hear
I'm
that.
glad I did. Partly to broaden my knowledge base, but also so that the book is somewhere,
Mm.
and they print on demand. So in other words, there's no warehouse full of your books. When somebody wants it, they print it and it gets to the reader. So yeah, but it's a great resource for sure. Yes, Jared.
We have a question from online. Jane is asking, would publishing from blog or internet route have different targeted readers or writing style? For example, I couldn't really see the difference when I read some books that are originally from blogs, but I wasn't sure if it's the result of editing when it is actually in the published form.
That's a good question. Yeah, it's interesting. The quality of writing is all over the place. In a traditional published book, sometimes the quality of writing is lagging, and in a blog, it could be just fantastic. Blogging is interesting though, because blogging is publishing. So you have to be careful, because some publishers will shy away from something that's been published on your blog, when half the time you're blogging to attract the eye of a publisher. So, but if a publisher does pick up a blog, chances are it's probably going to have been edited more thoroughly, and that might affect the quality of the writing for sure. So yeah, it's an interesting interaction between publishers and bloggers. But you do have to be careful, because if you publish something on your own blog, I have a newspaper column, for example, and they're personal essays mostly, but if I would have published some of those first on my blog, I couldn't have sold them for the column. So you have to be careful. But then some publishers will look at the most successful bloggers, and that is where they troll to find the next book contract. So yeah, it's an interesting relationship. Yes, Jared.
We have another question from online. Erin says, hi, Joni, you mentioned this briefly, but could you please repeat the websites, lists, and/or magazines we can go to for lists of available literary agents?
Sure. Publishersmarket.com. I think that's the mother lode. Query tracker. I think it's just one word. And duotrope is another one. So I remember, gosh, going to the library and looking at Publishers Market when it was the actual volume, like a phone book, only this big. And it's fun too to see them all and who they represent. Or I don't know if they put their actual authors, but they certainly put the types of books they've represented and things like that. And so it's a great resource. And you don't have to read, of course, the whole thing. And you can always winnow down your search. You know, you're writing speculative, romance, which agents represent that genre, or which agents represent cozy mysteries, or which agents represent literary fiction, or which agents are looking for topical narrative nonfiction projects. So you can narrow it down too. But yeah, those are great resources.
I actually did have a follow-up question or two for you. So one thing that I've been hearing a lot from classmates is if they have something that they've been working on, it could be a novel that they've finished, they have like a full first draft, or it could be a novella or what have you, but they're not really able to break through that barrier to get to the literary agent, and they're exploring the idea of hiring an editor and paying out of pocket
Right.
to get that up to some standard. What are your thoughts on that process?
Oh gosh, publishers and editors are all for that, but they're not the ones who are paying for it, but it is, how the world is working now. The editors at the publishing houses just aren't going to necessarily spend that much time to help you to take it up to that ultimate level. And so certainly people in the industry are all for that. I teach workshops and I work with a ton of writers. And so I definitely seek feedback. I talked about that. I definitely participate in workshops or get beta readers. And I have, even now, with the latest collection of essays, for a few of the essays where I really wanted to feel secure, I did pay a professional editor. Say, can you take a look at this? And not to copy edit it, but is it working on the bigger level? So it's a developmental editor, if you will. And I didn't do it for the whole collection, but I certainly know people, and frankly, people hire me to do that a lot. And you have to be super, super careful, not with me, but there are a lot of book consultants out there, book doctors, who will give you advice that to me is too generic to really incite and entice you to go back to your desk and know what to do next. I find the best way to start is to find a really good workshop, because A, it's economical, and B, you will get real boots on the ground feedback. So you can improve your work scene by scene by scene by scene. And then if you still feel, which you might, that your novel now needs a big overview read, it'll be in so much better shape, and you might get some really good targeted feedback on the flow, the profluence, did you frame it right, things like that. But a workshop really can help you to just each component, each unit of whatever that project is, fiction or narrative nonfiction, will really help you drill down and elevate it. And so the whole book will be elevated even before anybody sees it. So that's one route to go, is a workshop or peer review group who really is committed to giving each other specific feedback. Or you can hire Author Accelerator, I think, is a program that's fairly new. And if you ever listen to #MWriting, that's a really good podcast. And I think one of the hosts is affiliated or founded Author Accelerator. And that's a resource where they actually are training book consultants that will look at your whole manuscript. And there's a couple of people in my workshops now who have finished manuscripts or complete manuscripts, and they've hired a couple of the editors from Author Accelerator. So that's a good resource. But, again, you don't want to keep throwing money at the problem. You want to see what you can do on your own and with peer groups and things like that. But yeah, it's a great idea. And there is such a thing as too much feedback. But yeah, Jared.
We have Al who would like to ask a question from the monitor directly. Go ahead, Al.
Hi, Joni. Thank you so much
Hi,
for doing this. Hey, I wanted to, first of all, say how amazed and proud I am of your accomplishments, the number of books that you published and your experience in academia. and in all these different genres is actually remarkable.
Thank you.
So your persistence is inspiring. I also have a wardrobe filled with these badges of honors of rejection letters.
Yeah, don't we all? Yeah. I say rejection buys you a free drink.
Yeah. So I have been contemplating a little bit about self-publishing. The area that I write in is I write epic novels, so everything is in verse, so they're poems, but they tell a complete story. So I would have been really popular about 1,000 years ago. And so I don't think it's a really burgeoning market. So I wouldn't exactly know how to go about it. I've been, doing poetry competitions, but I think I'd like to start looking at it more seriously as a novel. The only question I have really as it results in self-publishing is that as I've been researching, a lot of these different prizes that are available, like the Griffin Prize, they specifically exclude self-published artists from entering any of these competitions.
Yeah.
So I want to see what your advice is, what your experience is with that. Is that here to stay? Are there other downfalls to self-publishing? Is there a way to reverse track at some point? And what is the cost-benefit analysis on that from your more informed perspective?
Yeah. Self-publishing, I think, does not end up being that expensive versus, say, hybrid publishing, which is, I think, very expensive. So the cost is fine. That is a hard reality that self-publishers and even people who publish through hybrid publishing often are treated like second-class citizens. They don't get on the shelves, their books don't get on the shelves, and they're not accepted by contests sometimes, and it's just a hard and unfair reality. That said, no one can argue with readership. And if you're a self-published because that's the way you think the fastest route and the smartest route to go through, then you are still now giving yourself the ability to get readers. And, we all have to do our own self-promotion. So, you could really promote the bejesus out of the book and hopefully get some real readers, especially a book like yours, where you say, well, that's, might have been in its prime 1,000 years ago. And, I think traditional publishers might say that. They're always second guessing the market. You probably heard my story earlier about, don't write any books about Afghanistan, Kalamazoo, because Afghanistan's passé. They don't always know what's best. And sometimes books that are in interesting niches have more of a readership than we would ever assume. And they certainly will have a very appreciative readership, even if the size isn't that big. So there is a reward to that, but the downside is exactly what you were talking about, that you don't necessarily get a chance to be in these things that help to promote the authority of the book, the quality of the book, the literary thing. I hope there's exceptions, but I actually don't know if there are. I do know, though, if you start by trying to sell the book to your local outlets, that can kind of help. If you're, live here in Norwich and, very much more conducive to a self-published book might be the local bookstore because you live here. So that's a way to begin to get it in and some exposure too. It doesn't help with the contests, but I don't know. I think there should be a big shift with that. And there are, though, actually some specific contests specifically for self-published or independent publishers. So you could look into that, but it's kind of tricky. Yeah, the world is not tilted towards self-publishers yet. But readers don't care whether you're self-published or you're a hybrid publisher or you're published by, they couldn't care less. They just want to find a good book. So that is a beautiful thing. A good book is a good.
But Joni, I mean, you ended up working in academia at some point, and my assumption is that on your resume, had all of your books been self-published, that may not have spoken necessarily that well towards your job prospects.
Yeah, you might be right. One thing I've found, I was the program director for a literary festival last year, and what was really interesting was that nobody really knows authors' names. You might know the book, but they rarely know authors' names, and they sure as heck don't know or care where a book is published. So readers certainly don't feel like it matters. And to some degree, I think that trickles up, that if you have 7 books out and they're legit books, often, the sleuthing doesn't necessarily, look into, well, now, was that a small independent? Was that, whatever? Clearly, if it's more impressive if it's maybe a Random House because of name recognition. But, half the time they don't know whether it's a small publisher or a self-publisher, and nobody cares. The writer cares, the snobs care, certain people care, but if it's a good book, it's a good book. So yeah, it probably wouldn't flare off the page. It's like, whoa, they're published by, I keep saying Random House, but there's even, snobbier ones. But I think it's still a legit credential. Yeah, and it's funny because I worry about the same thing. I was like, oh gosh, after that first 2 books, my publishers have gotten smaller. And will that work against me? But it just hasn't seemed to matter. So, but yeah, these are things it's so good you recognize because we can then work around them. Anyway, I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah. I want you to connect with your readers. Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, I'm saying hi to Al.
Fantastic. Does anybody have any other questions at this time? I think we're good then. Thank you so much for everybody coming out, whether it be in person or via Zoom. There will be a recording of this put out at some point, and you'll be able to access all of this information, whether it be the websites that were mentioned or any of this really, so at your leisure. So be on the lookout for that. But otherwise, thank you again so much for all your time and for making this such a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Julie.
This is what I mean about connecting with readers and writers. That's such a reward. It really is. So, but you can't do that if you don't have a book out. And so self-publishing, hybrid publishing, whatever. Once the book is out, you have this wonderful opportunity.